have two levels of membership for the webinars, which are weekly, and for electronic copies of our publications, plus all previous publications we've done, it's £5 a year, which less than 10 pence a week, which I think we can all agree is a pretty good price. If you want physical copies of the journal and magazine, it's £20 a year.
We're good to go, yeah? So
yeah.
let's talk about this. This is the 26th of November 1977 we're talking about. I'm going to talk about it tonight for a couple of reasons. First of all, because there's been some recent developments in this quite interesting case in the not too distant past. Secondly, because this is one of those still unfolding stories, albeit there's not much left to unfold. So what I'm going to share with you tonight is above and beyond what you'll even find on the Wikipedia page, which is quite useful. The Wikipedia page should have been updated in the light of some discoveries that came to light last year, but it hasn't been, and there's a fairly good reason for that, which we'll talk about later on. But basically, on the 27th of November, sorry, my bad, 26th of November 1977 at 5:10 in the evening, the ITN evening news was interrupted. And specifically, it was interrupted apparently by aliens. Now, this bit I'm assuming is quite well known. If you're not familiar with the whole story, if you as an ASSAP member haven't heard this, then this is just a good story. In terms of the SS in ASSAP, the scientific study, I'd say this has something to teach us about the value of the way that you go about investigating a paranormal case scientifically. With my kind of more humanities bias, I think that from the point of view of social sciences, it's a hugely interesting case. To be clear about this, you can find apparently the interruption on YouTube. And although you can hear it on YouTube, let's be completely clear, you can't see what people saw on the night. The YouTube video is a concoction. It's apparently the original sound. And again, I'll get into how this can be the case later on, but you can trust the original sound on that clip. You can't trust the pictures. There's no video recording apparently of the actual event taking place, and the proof of that is that the eyewitness accounts all make it very clear about what happened. The guy on the right is Andrew Gardner. Andrew Gardner is described in various internet sources and whatever as a giant of television news, an enduring presence on British screens for many, many years. Also, the giant is the giant of UK news is it's a good-natured pun. Andrew Gardner was 6'5". He was a giant of a man. I'll personally attest to this just completely randomly, as you do. I was in a pub one lunchtime in the Weald of Kent in the mid-1990s, and Andrew Gardner was there as well. And we collided going in and out of the gents, and he was massive. He was 6'5" and quite a wide guy. So he was on screen. And what you see on the YouTube clip is a screen just going down to interference while the sound plays. In actual fact, all the eyewitness accounts agree on what happened at 5:10 during the early evening news on ITV. The news was on at 5:10 because this was a Saturday night, and the news had just come on after World of Sport. What actually happened was that the news pictures stayed exactly as they should have been, but the sound broke through. There was what was later described as a breakthrough in sound, which lasted over 6 minutes and was apparently a message from an alien. We've got just a snatch of that to give you some idea of it.
This is the voice of Allah, representative of the ASSAP Galactic Command, speaking to you.
And it went on for over 6 minutes. So having started this riveting presentation, I'll show you a little bit of what the voice actually said. You can take your time to read that. Before we do, just let me explain the thing at the top. Clearly, there was no written text that was given out with this. So your spelling of the individual concerned, Brillon, Girillon, or Asteron, depends entirely on your ears, I suppose. But this is edited highlights of the message for mankind. I will shut up and have a sip of tea for a couple of seconds and just let you drink that in. So a summary of the message was that mankind was in trouble, basically. The usual kind of 1950s stuff. It's day the earth stood still kind of message. The gist of this is that during the early evening news on ITV, this message came through. Mankind was warned that if we didn't mend our ways, become less warlike and more peaceful, we were in danger of being wiped out. But it was essentially a positive message that if we could raise our consciousness, we could become one with the galactic consciousness that ASSAP Galactic Command knew all about. Great. On the other hand, let's be clear about when and where this message went out. This message went out on Southern television and only Southern television. So these highly advanced aliens that were threatening mankind thought the best way to do it was to tell the people of Dorset, Hampshire, basically. What you're looking at on the left here is the map of Southern television. So at this point, if there are any young people in the room who don't remember the days of regional ITV when the regionality was a very strong factor, I'd better briefly go over this. ITV was divided up into different regions. And what happened was that the regulator, in this case, during the period when ASSAP Galactic Command broke through, the regulator was the IBA, the Independent Broadcasting Authority. They would give a franchise for a set amount of time to a set amount of territory to somebody who could provide all the ITV programming that was required. Some of it was the standard stuff. So everybody showed Coronation Street, everybody showed ITN's news, but everybody had to provide their own regional news. Groups of interested people came together and bid for the franchise. It still works like that, but it was a lot more powerful in terms of franchises in the 1970s than it is now, because there were basically 3 television channels in almost every place. And of the 3 television channels, the outlier by a country mile was BBC Two. So Southern television, crudely, had a patch that you can see there in red. It goes more or less from left to right, from Dorchester to Dover, and then it strays at the top end. It strays into what's now the Wessex AONB, the area of natural beauty. And in those days, to have an ITV franchise put you in a very powerful position, because you were going to get the best advertising revenues of anybody in your area by having access to a television channel. If I take a little bit of a diversion here, as I've mentioned to people occasionally before, I very, very briefly worked for the Glove Puppet Sooty as a scriptwriter. And I remember one of the producers, this is in late 1990s, I started working for Sooty in 1997. I remember one of the producers who went back nearly a quarter of a century with Sooty. So he'd worked with Sooty when Sooty was the property, or had a deal with Thames Television in the early 1970s. And he made a joke about the danger, the physical danger that you faced at Thames Television, which was that if you opened a cupboard and stood too close, you might be injured by an avalanche of cash as it came out of the cupboard. ITV was very powerful. So for somebody to break in there was a significant thing. It got national news coverage, but we'll come back to this later on into where they actually broke in. The entire Southern television network was not infiltrated. Literally one area to do with one transmitter was infiltrated. And predictably, it got national news coverage. This is just a couple of spots from different articles at the time. I draw your attention on the right, the voice of Astron. I mean, nobody knew who this was. So the different names, Vrillon has been more recently adapted, and there was a podcast series in 2022 which discussed this entire case in some depth. They went with Vrillon, but since nobody ever actually produced a written outline of the words, your guess is as good as mine. Very, very quickly, the following day, IBA, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, issued a statement confirming it was a hoax. IBA are remembered amongst broadcast regulators for being unduly robust in certain cases. I mean, it's become a kind of running joke in British broadcasting, and it'll be interesting to see where the Gary Lineker situation ends at the moment. But it's become a kind of running joke in British broadcasting that broadcast regulators are so far in bed with the people that they regulate sometimes that they're toothless. Well, the IBA were not. The IBA actually issued some fairly draconian penalties occasionally in their tenure from 1972 to 2003. And one of the reasons they lasted so long was that their willingness occasionally to sanction people actually impressed people like government. And if you look at the time that they were in power as regulators from 72 to 2003, clearly they went through different shades of government, from very strong majority governments to occasionally governments that were absolutely tottering. So they lasted longer than most of your broadcasting regulators. But from the following day, and certainly within a few days, perhaps best highlighted by the letter to the Times, there was one belief among certain people that this was the real deal. Whether or not it came through in just a patch of Hampshire and a little bit of Dorset is beside the point. There were people prepared to believe from as early as a few days afterwards and go public with it that this might have been a genuine message from aliens. So the letter to the Times basically said, can the IBA or anyone else be sure the broadcast was a hoax? Nobody's ever been brought to justice for this. Nobody's ever openly admitted it was them. So for a long, long time, this was debated. And again, my time in ufology, I'm conscious sometimes when I'm doing these ASSAP webinars, people say like, well, oh, I don't know much about aliens. I think if the way ASSAP do it, I think you do a pretty good job actually at your conferences where it's mixed in with everything else. Because actually, funnily enough, when you get ufology in isolation, it's often quite poisonous. I say that because the three possibilities you're looking at here have been hotly debated and were hotly debated for a long, long time. So the British UFO literature of the early 1980s, for example, discussed this case. If you were in a research group in the 1980s, as I was, it was a regular topic of conversation, not to the point where it would overtake everything else, but to the point where every once in a while somebody would mention it, the same old tropes would get reeled out, discussions would go on about what the hell this was, and these were the three possibilities that kind of hardened and just endured for many years. Number one, this was genuine aliens. For all the incredible nature of the fact that they just went to one place at one time and spoke to a bunch of people mainly in Hampshire, and chose to do so just as the 5 o'clock news was starting, the 5:10 news was starting. There are people, and there were people for a long, long time holding out for the fact that this might have been genuine, right? In terms of people in ufology and around it discussing it, it tended to harden into two other viewpoints. Number one, that this was ufologists hoaxing, but there's a subdivision. So you could either go with the viewpoint that it might have been people involved in ufology doing it for a laugh, but also to raise the profile of ufology, okay? Alternatively, it could have been that it was one faction of ufology trying to make everybody else's life quite hard. And specifically, the faction of ufology that might have had the biggest motivation to do it were those who believed in the decades-old stories of contactees, because Ashtar has form. If you were to Google Ashtar, something we'll come to again in a minute, you'll find that actually Ashtar Galactic Command in various offshoots has endured for a long, long time. It's appeared in UFO literature and to do with ascended masters trying to contact humanity since the 1950s, okay? The third opinion is that hoaxers, i.e. people intent on doing something hoaxing the media, had just simply picked on ufology and UFO content as something that would work very well in that context. Now, if we go with all of those, then Ashtar, as in Ashtar as a galactic being, feeds these very, very well. The building you're looking at on the left-hand side is the Integratron, which is in the desert in California. It was the brainchild of a man called George W. Van Tassel, who wrote a few books, including The Mystery of the Flying Saucer Revealed, which you're looking at there. Van Tassel in 1952 wrote about his contact with an ascended being called Ashtar. So Ashtar Galactic Command clearly has some resonance to do with that decades old story, a story that was a quarter of a century old by the time the Southern TV viewers were treated to their breakthrough in sound. And in that sense, Ashtar is an enduring presence in ufology. And I don't want to go down this huge, great rabbit hole, but the Ashtar movement is so significant in the history of UFO belief that people who study UFOs, particularly as ufology, in a religious context, i.e. theologists who think about the relevance in the present days and day and time to the way that ufology now is almost a surrogate religion, or that there are religions spinning off ufology, which is something I'll address later on. Ashtar is involved in all of those. So the Ashtar movement, whilst it's been going since the 1950s, really got big traction in the 1990s. The 1977 breakthrough in sound is just a stepping stone on the way. So you could look at this as people who believed the contactee movement of the 1950s trying to raise the profile of it. You could also think that if this was hoaxers just trying to break into British media, then they'd got their hands on old UFO books. They'd got a pretty interesting, lively story. They tagged a lot of woolly cosmology on the top of it and just used it as the means of a fairly high profile hoax. One of the reasons that we don't talk so much about Ashtar these days is that the work of people like Bud Hopkins, you'll see the slide on the right there, overtook it. So in terms of the number of times that people met beings like Ashtar, that declined rapidly in the 1980s. And when people reported entities, the overarching belief amongst most people who investigated UFOs, who believed in aliens, from kind of like the mid to late 80s onwards, is that the Greys, the so-called Greys, were the main aliens visiting the world. That people like Bud Hopkins and John Mack, who were hypnotizing witnesses, were discovering all of this. And books like Missing Time, which became bestsellers, more or less consigned Ashtar to cult status at best, right? This is Ashtar cult status. So this is nothing to do with the breakthrough in sound. This man is not guilty. The guy on the left is Chris Holmes. The thing on the right is part of the artwork produced for his band Ashtar Command, who exists somewhere between kind of indie rock, psychedelic rock, and at the same time have quite a sense of humor. Banging tunes, but they're according to the Wikipedia, they're a going concern. According to Discogs, they haven't released anything in well over a decade now. I'd love to hear them back because I used to play them on my radio show occasionally. But Ashtar is a kind of a trope with which people play. The notion of an ascended master, an ascended cosmic being, is something that's inspired people's imagination, up to and including people like Chris Holmes, who apparently has no belief in the reality of this. Okay. But there are UFO religions. There are definitely people whose consciousness to do with the universe, the cosmos, is inspired by a belief that it's full of ascended masters, and that if humanity behaves in certain ways, we can join them. And probably the highest profile around the world are the Raelians. The guy on the right-hand side is Claude Verhillon, who's he's now known as Rael, but he's the founding Raelian. And be careful what I say. I don't think there's any Raelians looking in, but a couple of things to say about this. First of all, it's been a very potent UFO-based religion around the world, particularly in places like Southeast Asia. It's got all the things that people see as warning signs among cults, i.e., it seems very good at recruiting young women, despite the fact that it's run by an older man. The individual behind it, clearly Raelians believe that he's an ascended master and that they themselves can join this ascension and become ascended beings like Ashtar. On the other hand, if you look at Claude Verhillon's life story before he was leading the religion, he had exotic jobs that weren't necessarily spectacularly successful. If you were to Google his motor racing career, he was definitely a racing driver, but he never won anything. By complete contrast, he's been a very successful leader of a UFO-based religion. So Ashtar has company. That's what I'm saying, basically. Right? And In the UK, we've also got UFO-based religions here. In fact, the most successful and enduring such thing is, I talked about this very, very briefly when I spoke at the Seriously Strange weekend in September. I've had dealings with these people, and I had one of my more memorable moments in UFO investigation took place with these people. So if I tell you what you're looking at in the middle, then let me just have a little bit of a rant about something that's not on screen, but something that happened to me. What you're looking at in the middle is George King. George King was a London taxi driver in the 1950s before he met the master Aetherius on Holdstone Down in Devon, at which point a religion was founded that sees King in the great tradition of Buddha, Jesus Christ, as an ascended master on earth, leading us to a higher consciousness. And in the photograph you're looking at, what's happening is that George King is charging a prayer power battery. If you were to Google this, the Aetherius Society, which he founded and which continues today in the building that was his home in Fulham, they had a project called Operation Prayer Power, which involved them chanting Buddhist mantras, and then the leaders of the Aetherius Society going forward and helping to charge prayer power batteries, which is what he's doing here. The prayer energy that they were generating was then released at various times to make a significant and positive difference to the earth, i.e. it prevented terrible things happening. And of course, this is in the classic sense, when they did this is the proving of a negative, because the terrible things that were in danger of happening didn't happen because they opened the batteries. That's as they see it. The gentleman on the left is the current head of the Aetherius Society in the UK. And he's been there for a number of years now. And like I say, I had dealings with them. That Richard Lawrence is the guy that you're looking at there. I had dealings with them about 21 years ago, and it was quite one of the more meaningful moments of UFO investigation I've done. I was writing a UFO book, long out of print now, but one of the things I was looking at was the Aetherius Society and UFO religions in general. And I rang them up to see if I could get one or two details to help with the book. And they were having a meeting on Holdstone Down in Devon, which is their most sacred mountain, because this is where George King met the Master Aetherius, who came in a UFO, basically. And Richard Lawrence said, well, we're chanting up on the mountain. Why don't you join us? And I had a wonderful 2 hours. You chant Buddhist mantras, the classic Buddhist mantras, which most of us might recognize. You spend 2 hours mildly hyperventilating in absolutely gorgeous surroundings, overlooking the Bristol Channel as it was then. Beautiful summer day. And I was mildly buzzy coming off the mountain at the end of all of that. Completely legal, great. And I got talking to some members of the Aetherius Society, including one who was a dentist. And apologies if you've heard this story because I've mentioned it at the Ghost Club or whatever, but the revelation for me really was that if I'd stopped and managed to persuade him that actually this was a religion, but might not be based on anything you could ever prove, because it might just be a completely false set of beliefs, but I made the guy's life a lot worse. So, I mean, at that particular point, who had the problem, me or him? I was quite skeptical about it, but I had a thoroughly enjoyable 2 hours. And the point I'm making with regard to the breakthrough in sound is double here. Number one, these cosmically based religions, depending on ascended masters, are all over the place. And the Aetherius Society and the Raelians would be the best known examples. In this country, the best known example is the Aetherius Society, which was founded here. Secondly, and we'll come back to this later on, the gentleman you're looking at on the left-hand side, Richard Lawrence, in a podcast series in 2022, which tried to get to the bottom of the breakthrough in sound and the Ashtar breakthrough in 1977 on Southern Television, spent an episode considering whether Richard Lawrence, the guy you're looking at there on the left, who's been the leader of the Aetherius Society in the UK longer than anybody has ever been it, whether he was the person responsible. On the right-hand side, what you're looking at, and I'll talk about this briefly, then move on, that's the Giant Rock. It's one of the Flying Saucer conventions at Giant Rock in California, which took place from the late 1950s into the 1970s, 1952 to 1978. It's recently been revived, but the 1952 to 78 were quite sincere meetings. These were meetings where people were turning up in expectation of possibly seeing flying saucers and in the certain expectation of meeting people who had met ascended masters who traveled in flying saucers, and these people would get up and speak at the Giant Rock UFO convention. Other forms of ufology eventually overtook it, but this was a hugely popular event, very, very briefly. The organizers, with some justification, claimed that the highest ever attendance of that event was 10,000 people. So it was hugely, a lot of people believed that ascended masters traveled through the cosmos in what we would now recognize as UFOs, and that they were contacting people on Earth who would come and speak to them, who would come and speak to groups of people and pass this on, right? But if it wasn't contactees, if Ashtar Galactic Command breaking through to Southern Television in 1977 wasn't contactees, then the other significant possibility is that it was hoaxes. And ufology, probably more than most areas of the paranormal, I mean, I'd bow to the greater wisdom of the people who are watching this at the moment as to the best ghost hoaxes and other paranormal hoaxes, but I would claim to know something about UFO hoaxes. But let me just briefly mention a couple. I've spoken about the one that you're looking at in the two pictures on the left before. Cedric Allingham wrote a book called Flying Saucer from Mars. If you've read a book called Flying Saucers Have Landed, which includes the account of George Adamski, who claims to have met a man from Venus, then it is blindingly obvious that Flying Saucer from Mars, in which Cedric Allingham meets a man from Mars, is a basic satirical rewrite of the George Adamski book. George Adamski met a man from Venus in the desert in California. Cedric Allingham met a man from Mars on a Scottish beach. Both books have photographs of the flying saucers. Both books describe a human but cosmically ascended person. The picture on the right apparently is Cedric Allingham, and the book claims this picture as an informal portrait. And whenever I show this, I make the point that if that's an informal portrait, this guy is not exactly a party animal. The man in the photograph is Peter Davis, who was the co-conspirator in producing the Cedric Allingham book. Patrick Moore was the other half of the partnership. He denied it to his dying day and threatened people with legal action, UFO investigators with legal action, but it was him. Indisputably, it was him. And clearly done to ridicule people who believed in all the UFO stories that were around. What you're looking at on the right is Flying Saucer Review, which was a long-standing British UFO research magazine. I mention this because they were hoaxed as well, that people have been creating hoaxes for no other reason than they want to see UFO investigators running around making fools of themselves. Often the motivation is that the people behind it are of a more skeptical and seriously scientific bent, and they'll mock the ufologists when they fall for the tricks. Flying Saucer Review was briefly hoaxed. I forget exactly when, sometime in the late 1960s, but the hoax was recreated and discussed in a BBC Two Horizon documentary in the 1980s. And basically what happened in that hoax was that the hoaxers had a stooge on a hillside during a skywatch. They'd got somebody planted amongst the skywatchers, whilst other members of the hoaxing team parked a car on the top of a nearby hill which had a light on the top of it. They turned the light on at a given time, and the stooge in the middle of the people doing the skywatch spotted the light on top of the hill, reported the UFO. Everybody else got very excited about this. The light then disappeared, at which point the story started turning up in UFO investigations with a load of pseudo-scientific justification for it, and then the hoaxes revealed themselves. What we can learn from this is that there have been very detailed, very time-consuming, very elaborate hoaxes staged on UFO investigators for the purpose of ridiculing their research methods and ridiculing the way that they often go for confirmation bias. And this entire methodology has been suspected for years as being behind the Ashtar Galactic Command hoax. Okay, I will admit to a certain amount of skin in the game here, but it's minor. And let me just talk about that, and then I'll tell you why we're looking at these two pictures. So obviously my as Claire told you, my interest in the paranormal has been lifelong, which means that I've been hanging around with people and investigating things myself. When I go and do live talks about it these days, you can't get out of the room doing a live talk about UFOs without somebody coming up and either telling you something that they believe very sincerely that others struggle to believe, or telling you the most uncanny, incredible thing that happened to them that they cannot understand, and it's made them very doubtful about what they thought about life before they had the experience. So my take on the Ashtar story is that it's an incredible story. It draws on the tales of things that people had experienced, but I always suspected that the people behind it weren't the ones that were often fingered, like the ufologists. I was a student in the early 80s and I was studying media, so we worked, when I was doing this, we worked with the local BBC radio in Newcastle in the northeast of England, and I was a student in Sunderland, so they had a satellite studio in Sunderland. So I used to get a good up-close look at the best technology available to BBC local radio in the 1980s. And it was only a generation on from the stuff you're looking at on the right. The picture on the left, so this is the Beatles recording in the mid-1960s. Sometime around, this is the point at which they're recording Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, the Sgt. Pepper album. And just look at the kit that they've got at their disposal. Now, if we go back and listen to that sound clip again, there's quite a lot of treatment of the sound. It's being compressed. They've got very, very good sound effects for 1977. One take on the hoax is that the people behind it, whether they were trying to ridicule ufologists or whether they were trying to make ufology more popular, were students. And I always disbelieved that. I just didn't think it was a bunch of students, mainly because I thought it was beyond the capabilities. Even if I'd known what to do with the BBC Radio Sunderland kit that I used to get my hands on every week, I couldn't have staged that hoax. Number one, because I wouldn't have been allowed to play with the gear long enough to do it. Simple as. So I always thought that the people behind it had to come from somewhere where they had access not only to good sound equipment, but to a lot of time using good sound equipment. This is 1977. Your ability to do things like create sound effects depended in certain cases on just a little bit of ingenuity, on being able to do something, being able to figure out a way of creating a sound because you couldn't just pull it off your computer. All right. And the kit you're looking at on the left is the kit that created basically the mixing desk that created Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was cutting edge for its time. But even that might have struggled to create Ashtar Galactic Command the way we heard it. Right? That said, one belief about the breakthrough in sound hoax for many years was that it might have been students. Like I say, my opinion was it couldn't have been, simply because I couldn't imagine the students who'd get their hands on that kit. But here is an example of a bunch of students who actually did something both very newsworthy, very elaborate, and it's known as the Great Flying Saucer Hoax. And it was actually the students of the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough in Hampshire. They did this on the 4th of September, 1967. And I was blathering about this about 3 weeks ago. Don't go out your way to hear this, seriously, but I was being interviewed for a podcast called Hop On Board, which is being produced by Southeastern Trains, basically, in near where I live. And the whole point was that they're going to do an entire podcast about paranormal places you can visit in Kent and Sussex, and they'd roped me in. This stunt went all the way from Clevedon in Somerset to Queenborough in Kent. So I was actually, when I was doing my little bit, we were stood as close as we possibly could be to the UFO that was placed in Queenborough on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent. And if you plot where these flying saucers touched the ground, I mean, clearly they were created by the RAE students, but if you plot where they actually were found on the ground that morning, it's pretty much a straight line. They also landed along a ley line. So it was a very elaborate hoax, very well thought out. They all had little ticking mechanisms inside them. So these are posed press photographs, but the one on the left, that really did happen, that amongst other things, they used bomb disposal equipment to listen to it because they weren't sure what the hell they'd got. There were a few identical UFOs, 54 inches across, and all put in these remote rural locations or near remote rural locations at the same time. A very elaborate hoax, and perpetrated by students, unquestionably so. Okay, so let's get to what actually happened in terms of what's known about how this was actually achieved. On the left-hand side, you're looking at the Hannington transmitter. Now, I've swapped messages with Ian Liston Smith, who I presume is still listening earlier on this week. I'll talk a little bit about Ian's blog later, but Ian's a broadcast engineer. Along with being an ASSAP member, his background is broadcast engineering. So he would know. When I swap messages, I'll cop for this. He was posting stuff on the ASSAP page, and I thought, oh hell, he's going to put so many spoilers in there. It won't be worth doing the webinar later on. So, but his blog has a lot that you can read later on after I've done this. But broadcast engineers had spotted something with this very, very soon after the initial breakthrough in sound hoax. You're looking at the Hannington transmitter. So literally, that is the scene of the crime. And when I say that is the scene of the crime, it is literally the scene of the crime. Number one, if this was humans breaking into broadcast transmissions, they were actually committing a crime. Number two, that is literally the scene of the crime, because that's a view taken from a road. If they arrived by road and approached the transmitter to break through, to actually overrun the transmitter with their own signal, then you're looking at where they were. They were somewhere in the field close to the copse of trees, where they were close enough to the transmitter to be able to overwhelm it. That map there shows you more or less where it is, very close to Watership Down. And for those of you around my age, you've probably got fond and occasionally furious memories of that level of cassette tape. When you Google pictures of cassette tapes now, you tend to get the kind of slicker, more rounded ones that were produced in the 1990s. But that is a genuine available 1977 cassette tape. So if you think about this as a hoax perpetrated by humans, then the best way of doing it would be to have a pre-recorded tape, to take broadcast equipment to the Hannington transmitter, and then to overwhelm it. And this is where broadcast engineering expertise comes in, because one thing that was spotted very quickly by people investigating this was that the transmitter that broadcast the breakthrough in sound was a rarity. Specifically, most British transmitters then were fed directly by a line. So effectively the signal came down the line, went into the transmitter, went into everybody's television aerials, and that's how you watched your TV. But there were a handful of television masts around the country that didn't work like that. For one reason or another, what they did was that they picked up a signal from another television mast and they rebroadcast it. And one of those was the Hannington transmitter, which was the focus of the breakthrough in sound. The Hannington transmitter actually picked up its signal from, pardon me, from the nearby Rowridge transmitter. So in other words, it was picking up from another mast. If you wanted to break into that, then it was a lot easier. You simply had to get there close enough with enough power to send another signal into that transmitter, which meant that the Rowridge one was interrupted and you could do it. Now, clearly, the longer you did it, the more chance you had of getting caught. So it makes sense, if you're going to do it, that possibly to do it at 5:10 on a Saturday night when it's getting dark, when you're out in the countryside, and get out of there before anybody can figure out that it's you. So we'll come to who might have been behind this and what the motivation might have been in a minute, but let's just take stock on this. This mystery has endured for a long, long time. Crudely, the best-selling Ford car when this happened was the one on the left, a Mark II Escort. When finally a name was put forward as somebody who was likely Vrillon, Asteron, whoever, i.e. the voice you heard. You're talking about late 2022 for a name to be brought forward. So it's taken that long. And in that particular period, there's been a lot of debate about who, what, why. I've covered that very, very briefly there. Either it was people who were hankering for the good old days of contactees. It was somebody trying to make ufologists look foolish. It was people just wanting to do something by way of a hoax, and ufology was the good means of doing it. All right, let's delay it a little bit longer. Let's have a talk about why this might matter to a group like ASSAP. In the end, it took quite a bit of critical thinking to unmask most of the facts on this. Not all of the facts are known, and we'll come to one or two little nuggets of enduring mystery in a minute. But if we look at the sort of gist of the evidence here, if you can remember anything of that message, our leaders, Earth's leaders, are not particularly people who are doing a good job, right? They're facile. It's certainly an anti-authoritarian message, albeit it doesn't declare that universally that the Earth's leaders are idiots, okay? Of all the programs it targeted, it was the news. All right. Another reason why people might not have come forward, let's be clear about this. What happened, if it's humans behind it, is a crime. And there are very good reasons why the police would not necessarily go very hard to prosecute. Apart from anything else, if this was students or if this was people with very little money, there was a clear danger if you prosecuted them. You were going to spend a lot of money getting people into court. At best, you would get them fined. And in the process of doing that, you would create cult heroes. So when nobody came forward to claim it, and when the initial investigations from the police produced nothing, I mean, this is 1977, there is not CCTV on the road from which that photograph of the Huntington transmitter was taken. You don't have CCTV anywhere where you can pick up a suspicious van that might be carrying broadcast equipment, right? And significantly, the hoaxes appeared to know where to strike, close enough to the Huntington transmitter to overwhelm the signal that was coming in from another transmitter, at which point they could get it out there. And there's a few other things to throw in here, which are the pictures that you're looking at on the slide. Unfortunately, I was swapping messages very recently with David Clark, who's one of the co-authors of the book that you see on the left, who is the younger of the two people that you see on the right there. They're the authors. That's Andy Roberts and David Clark. And one of the things I was saying was that I just think it's a shame that book's no longer available. Andy, who's the other co-author, the reason I was swapping the message is that Andy, who's the other co-author, was selling some old books that were previously the property of his son, which included a copy of Flying Sorcerers. It's a wonderful book, but unfortunately it's not available this side of a king's ransom at the moment. And it's a social history of ufology. And it's a history of all the people and the motivations that took individuals into ufology. And it's an extremely rich source of all sorts of anecdote. There's a story in there which unfortunately nobody can prove these days about George King, who founded the Aetherius Society. And the gist of the story is that George King was extremely drunk one night and turned up at a political meeting in London, fell promptly asleep. And then at the end of the meeting, having disrupted it when he arrived drunk and then snored his way through it, he asked a question at the end of the meeting, which was, how am I going to make £1 million? And the apocryphal story says that somebody told him to start his own religion. That's in Flying Sorcerers. I've spoken to Dave about the source for that story, who's long dead, unfortunately. You'll never be able to prove it now. But it's a rich source of social history and a rich source of one abiding truth, that the paranormal and ufology in particular attracts all manner of people for all manner of bizarre reasons. It has a fascination for them. So it's worth reading. Something else we know about ufology. What you're looking at on the right is a diagram of what's known as external locus of control, right? Crudely, there's variations on this, and I don't want to get into all the ins and outs, but Why this matters to our story here is this, that another thing that's known about ufology, the UFO subject, even if people don't believe it, tends to attract people, and this is not everybody that's interested in ufology, obviously, but it tends to attract people often who experience an external locus of control in their lives. The first sort of serious academic investigation of that goes back to 1975 by a guy called Stephen P. Aresta, who actually investigated people who believed in UFOs or who were interested in them for a number of psychological aspects, and discovered very strongly that they tended to be people who perceived their lives as out of their own control, and they were often attracted to the notion of UFOs and aliens because it was, in a shorthand way, it was a way of undermining everybody that ever controlled them. So if they saw themselves as highly intelligent but powerless in their work, then they got a certain comfort from believing that there was actually a greater truth out there that made the beliefs of the people controlling them irrelevant. Okay, rant over on that, but I think it's relevant to what we're about to discover. In 2022, the biggest move forward in the case in a long time came about. And actually, it was the result of a lockdown project. The guy you're looking at on the left-hand side is Tommy Trelawney, who's hugely popular on YouTube and is a podcaster. And he likes digging into, like a lot of these podcasters, he likes digging into stories that abiding stories that have been around for ages, that don't tend to get covered by the mass media for any one of a number of reasons, like they're very marginal. And this is podcasting gold, as the Wilderness Dog is discovering now. He set up on a series called The Interruption, where he made it his business to actually get to the truth of what had happened on 26th of November 1977 and who had made it happen. And over a very lengthy series of 8 episodes, he went into all the blind alleys that were available. This is the guy that suggested that Richard Lawrence of the Aetherius Society was Vrillon. Spoiler alert, he isn't. Although there's a big revelation in the middle of that, was that when he interviewed Richard Lawrence and accused him of that, Richard Lawrence was somewhat nonplussed. And then Richard Lawrence pointed out something that's never been discussed in British ufology, which is that before he was head of the Aetherius Society, he's actually a trained actor. And Richard Lawrence quite curtly said to Tommy Trelawney, if that had been me, I'd have put in a better performance. One of these two people is the voice you heard and is the main instigator. And it's this guy. So the story that Tommy Trelawney turned up covered most of the bases. We'll come to what is unknown at the moment and what may never be known. This is Bob Tomalski. Bob Tomalski died in 2001, a few weeks before his 48th birthday. Bob Tomalski, if you're of a certain age, was the gadget guru. He actually turned up on the Gadget Show on television. And he was a broadcaster, but he was also a radio pirate. And his Wikipedia page describes him as a long-time proponent of broadcasting freedom. Bob Tomalski actually fits the social science profile of people who are attracted to ufology almost perfectly. Yeah. This is a guy who had incredible abilities in certain areas, certainly with regard to sound production. He was a pirate radio broadcaster, and his pirate broadcasts were more inventive and more pushing of the capabilities of sound at the time he was doing it than was a lot of mainstream broadcasting. And he was somebody who was constantly frustrated by his attempts to get into more mainstream radio because he didn't fit. When I read about Bob Tomalski, because I didn't know anything about him being responsible, so I was sort of right. My hunch all along had been that the people behind the breakthrough in sound were people who had, like I said earlier, not only access to the best sound production technology, but access to a lot of time in which to use it. Because in 1977, you could not have created the 6 minutes of authentic sound you can hear on YouTube unless you had that access. Bob Tomalski did, absolutely. And when I started reading about Bob Tomalski, the person he most reminded me of was a guy called Joe Meek. If you're unfamiliar with Joe Meek, he's worth a Google, a maverick British record producer, rather. There's a movie about him, and you know, he died in somewhat tragic circumstances. But Joe Meek and Bob Tomalski shared a particular skill, which is that before computer technology, digital technology in its widest implications, made a lot of sound production very, very easy. These were people who would get the sounds they wanted any way they could manage to get them. Bob Tomolsky was certainly that animal. And not only that, but he was thinking ahead of the game with regard to technology. So he often invented gadgets that would do particular things with regard to broadcasting. Now, what Tommy Trelawney discovered was that it had been a fairly open secret among Bob Tomolsky's mates for years that he was the guy behind this, i.e. he was the main instigator. That is his voice you hear. This was his script. This was his vision to do this kind of thing. And this was his notion that the Hannington transmitter, because it was picking up from another transmitter, was the ideal location to do it. All right. Those things definitely were Bob Tomolsky's doing. When Tommy Trelawney mentioned him and named him in the last episode of his Interruption podcast, the first thing I did after that was to get in touch with a few people I've known for years who've been involved in radio and say, well, did you know Bob Tomolsky? Of the many people I contacted, 6 people said yes. And you can't libel the dead, but I'm going to try and be fair for all that. It would be fair to say that Bob Tomolsky was a Marmite figure, absolutely a Marmite figure. I swapped messages with people who clearly hated him. And what they disliked about him was I heard the word, well, I saw the words written in a Facebook message, Anorak Solutions, i.e. Bob was the kind of guy that would make something happen because he could rig the technology up to do it. He often created gadgets that were very, very useful, but were never going to be particularly commercially useful because they were too complicated or they were too specific for one thing. The people who loved Bob Tomolsky loved that ingenuity about him. And the tragedy, I think, in all of this, I didn't know the guy. I only have heard about him secondhand, so I wouldn't presume to say any more than that. I think if there's one tragedy in this, it's that the guy you're looking at would have loved the age of internet radio when he could have been anything he wanted, even if there was only 150 people listening. So those of us who have never liked commercial music now found ourselves with our own radio shows. I mean, I'll claim a certain amount of skin in the game on this one, that, if there's one of you in every town and you can get some access to internet radio, you can go and find those people. And if you're broadcasting to 2,000 people around the world, all of whom think that they think it's only them that likes those sounds, well, this is the age when that's possible. Bob Tomolsky tragically didn't live long enough for that. But he is definitely the main instigator. Let's go over a few enduring mysteries before we tie this up then. Mystery number 1. Tommy Trelawney does not get to the bottom of this and conspicuously gives the question a swerve. Did Bob act alone? The suspicion I've got is that he didn't. That I just think in terms of the practicalities of this is 1977. You're probably arriving in a big old car or you're arriving in a van. You've got broadcast equipment that needs to overwhelm that mast, and it's not the lightest thing, albeit it's not as big as you'd think, because you're going to place it very close to the mast and then just kick it off at that point. And you only need a car battery to power it because it's only going to have to work for a few minutes. So you could do that, but realistically, your best chance of not getting discovered is to pile out, carry all the stuff through a hedge and over the field while your mate drives away and then comes around and picks you up a few minutes later. So my guess is that Bob did not act alone. Tommy Trelawney really doesn't address that question, but what he does address is the fact that this was an open secret amongst a handful of people for a number of years that Bob Tomolsky was Vrillon, Grillon, Ashtar, all of that. He put the whole thing together. So it clearly didn't come from ufology. Best guess, he'd read some of the more wacky 1950s contactee books, and that was just great material to work with. The other thing that you may still wonder about this is whether this has made a difference to how we understand it these days. Conspicuously, the YouTube clip that you can see, which has the whole message in it, has the complete tape. Nobody is arguing that the sound recording you hear on YouTube is the real deal. Everybody who was there, and people who know this story backwards, will tell you that the video you see on YouTube is not the original broadcast. Andrew Gardner appeared as Andrew Gardner reading the news. It's just that you didn't hear him doing that. You heard the voice of Vrillon breaking through instead, which makes it absolutely clear that recordings of this, the original recording, has existed and has been made available by a handful of people, even if they're not outing themselves. And there's a very good reason why the people who might have known all about this for a long, long time don't want to be too public, because technically speaking, some of these people are still criminals if they're around. I mean, the chances that they would get prosecuted for what they did in 1977 now are minimal. But on the other hand, for various reasons, it might be that some of them still don't want it on their record because they think it would spoil their current professional life. But Bob's your cosmic uncle. Okay. Why would I presume to talk to ASSAP about this? Well, I think there's loads of things to learn from this. I think actually a bit of common sense has applied itself over the years, and that's what's proven itself to be the most useful way of solving the problem. Just a one-stop shop of an argument. If you're looking at anything that claims to be proof, video, audio, or similar of something truly paranormal, I suppose one of the first questions to ask is, what's the best hoaxes that could be created by the best technology that's currently available? Just as an aside here, because I do most of my live UFO talks in and around Kent, just randomly I get messaged occasionally by people who've got videos of UFOs and stuff like that. Well, yeah, in the last couple of weeks, I've seen 3 that were blatantly drones. There is some suspicion, and there's not many of us are suspecting this, but I'm pretty sure I've seen the evidence that there are 1 or 2 people not far from where I live who are flying drones low over marshland that's near major roads for no other reason than they're trying to create UFO reports and probably laughing if these things ever happen. Now, the best technology at the moment, i.e. the best drone technology, will let you do that. You can fly a drone very low to the ground. If somebody's driving through the North Kent marshes and they just glance across a bit of flat land and they see a light hanging in the sky, they're still trying to drive their car. They don't know how big the object is. If you flew a tiny drone about 150 feet from the road, and then somebody subsequently reported a huge, great spaceship in the sky low over the sea, you'd have a good laugh, wouldn't you? So we need to be critical, because actually, when you look at what's now known about the breakthrough in sound hoax of 1977, it was clearly the best you could do with time and technology at your disposal. All right. And secondly, there is absolutely no doubt what social science has been claiming about people who are attracted to ufology, either just to explore the ideas in it for no other reason than their own amusement, or because they believe in those ideas. Again, Bob Tomolsky is a very close fit to somebody who, highly intelligent, but the external locus of control thing. Bob Tomolsky's story is that he was marginally successful in the media, but that also he was constantly rebuffed by the people who had real power in the game, to the point where you can see his hoax in 1977 as the full embodiment of what the Wikipedia page describes of him. It was quite literally an act perpetrated by a proponent of broadcasting freedom, because for 6 minutes he'd broken into mainstream broadcasting and he disrupted the news. Okay, almost there. People, just general things to learn from this. This is in a great tradition where disinformation, one way or the other, is just part of the narrative of the paranormal in general. If you've not seen it, I would thoroughly recommend a not exactly life-affirming documentary called Mirage Men. The guy on the cover of the video there is Richard Doty, an officer of the Air Force. This is the American Air Force, by the way, a FOSI, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Richard Doty was a disinformation agent. The American Air Force briefly had a real problem with a guy called Paul Benowitz, who was filming at Kirtland Air Force Base, or he was filming things in the air around Kirtland Air Force Base, and was getting footage of cutting-edge military technology. Richard Doty was the guy sent in to intercept him, to make him believe he was filming aliens. It's not a life-affirming story. The last days of Paul Benowitz were far from happy. But disinformation becomes part of the narrative. A lot of what Paul Bennewitz believed became believed by lots of people. A lot of what Bob Tomolsky created became believed by a lot of people, that it genuinely been the real deal. What you're looking at on the right is the crown of St. Stephen, and it has a huge role to play in ufology, but people just ignore this. The crash retrieval stories of UFOs often follow a particular template. A UFO crashes, it's recovered by a crack military crew, it's taken under high secrecy to a top secret location where it's investigated. Yeah, and these are the stories of crash retrieval that attach themselves to Roswell. But what I'm about to tell you really happened. The story was declassified and was a go-to for skeptical UFO magazines briefly in the early 1990s. In 1956, a bunch of American servicemen were told that they were taking a crate which contained the wings and engine of a flying saucer. And they were given a very special mission because they picked this crate up. And this crate traveled all the way from Budapest via Bremerhaven Harbor, right across the Atlantic to the United States, and ended up in Fort Knox. And what's interesting is that normally, if that was normal military cargo, you just simply change the shift. One bunch of servicemen would leave it in one place and it'd be picked up by another. Some of the servicemen that traveled with that cargo went the whole way and were told that they'd been selected for a special mission because of their abilities. They believed that they were taking the wings and engine of a flying saucer. That is the template for most crash retrieval stories. It was only in the late 1970s that the declassification of the whole story revealed what they'd really been carrying. They've been carrying what you were looking at. That is the crown of St. Stephen, part of the Hungarian crown jewels. Technically speaking, almost priceless from an insurance point of view, and spirited out of Hungary in 1956 because the Russians were coming. But there are Bob Tomolskys around today, and they're not all jokers. This really happened again. I heard Christian say that it couldn't happen again. Nobody would break through to British TV, would they? Well, they did, and they certainly gave it a go. Oliver Lewin. So he went to jail basically earlier this year, right? Because he was plotting to use breakthrough in radio, phone, and TV, etc., right? Now, he, by his own admission, is a fantasist, but on the other hand, that happened in the recent past. People still think this way, and they're not all jokers. That was that. If he'd succeeded in that, we wouldn't have been having a sort of good-natured webinar about it. Okay. Should you want to read a digested and very erudite, very intelligent take on this, then I would thoroughly recommend the blog, theouttheregroup.net. And given that this is an ASSAP member, and thank you very much, Ian, for not posting any more and doing any spoiler alerts on my webinar tonight. But his blog is definitely worth investigation. And on the 21st of January 2021, he wrote one of the more erudite pieces, albeit before Tommy Trelawney's podcast series, obviously. But he goes into some of the details I didn't explore in depth enough tonight. Okay, thank you very much for your time. I'll take the questions now rather than as we were going through that. I would love to see you all at the Seriously Strange weekend. Last bloody shameless bit of self-promotion here, but if anybody is remotely close to Gillingham on the 5th of June this year, I'm launching my new book, Why Mystery Matters, which is it's about why we should care about the mysterious, and why actually things that ASSAP do, and those of us just are fascinated by why it might actually be good for our mental health, and why we should all stick with it. You can get into that gig absolutely free because it's a publicly funded literary festival. So thank you very much, the council taxpayers of Gillingham, for paying my fee, but you can get into the gig absolutely free. It'd be good to see you there. Okay, rant over.
Thank you so much, Neil. That was an amazing talk as usual from you.